Of course, you have to realize that we had already started a train collector club, and that was called TCA, for Train Collector Association. And Lou Redmond was the spark plug behind that, and I met him by accident. When I was in school, I'd left Princeton one day, went into a hobby shop in Trenton, New Jersey that was run by a man who was interested in old toy trains as well as modern trains, such as HO, docksides, various things. And I went in to talk to him one day about a Knapp locomotive. And he says, "Don't ever change the wheels on that Knapp locomotive. It will be a collector's item one day." In fact, he said, "If you don't have to hurry back to school, I'd like you to wait around because I've got a couple of friends coming in. Lou Redmond is going to come in. I'll introduce you to him. And we're thinking about forming a group of men who are interested in old toy trains as collectibles." So I waited around, and I met Lou. And Bill Crames owned the hobby shop. And we discussed our interest in toy trains. And the truth is, they said, "If you could get the time, we'd like you to come with us." Well, I was busy, just gotten married, going to graduate from college, the two of us, start out in life. So I didn't have time for fussing around with old toy trains. And time went on until finally I ended up in Richmond, Virginia. And by that time, a club called TCA had started. All this time, Lou Redmond has been writing me a note here and there. "You ought to join our club. What are you doing?" Now, you have to know Lou. He was a raucous kind, but because of that, he formed what was a strong group of people, starting in Hershey, Pennsylvania. We met at the Cocoa Inn for 2 or 3 years. Finally, they tore down the Cocoa Inn, so we had to go someplace else. We ended up finally in York, Pennsylvania, at what was called the Cattle Barn. And we met for a time there until Lou finally found out that he could rent a hall at the York Fairgrounds. We rented that hall, and today we rent the whole fairgrounds. But that was the way that Lou went on and went on and went on, and things grew. I did join, and the only reason the Eastern Division extends to the James River is because I lived here. Otherwise, it would have all been in Pennsylvania. Then, as time went on, a few people learned of TCA who were living here in Richmond and the surrounding areas, and we got together, and some of them joined TCA. Then the time came when somebody says, "We ought to have a Virginia Train Club." Well, my first reaction to that was, why do we need another train club? We've already formed one. So I talked to Lou about it, and at that time Eric Buckley was our business manager. And so Lou and Eric and I, they used to call us the Triumvirate, we discussed it. And they said, "Well, we don't need another train club. It should be a division." And Lou says, "I have the Fort Pitt division, and that's because I live in Pittsburgh, a little distance away." what we should do is to form divisions around as people grow and become more interested. And in fact, very soon after that, there was another division formed, which was the WBNA, Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis. So we started taking in those that were as far over as the Eastern Shore and Atlantic Ocean. That was a right thing to do, I believe. But then I had these close friends, and they were mainly from a town of Louisa. And they would come into Richmond and we'd get together. They kept pushing on the idea we ought to form Virginia Train Collectors. So I pushed Lou and I pushed Eric Buckley and I say, look, they want to form this club. Lou says, well, we'll go down there, we'll meet together, and I'll tell them why they don't need another club. So Lou comes to Richmond, and Eric Buckley comes to Richmond, and we met with John Gilmer, I believe, was one. Bill Pettit was another. And we try to tell them, well, we have TCA already formed. You should be a strong part of that. John Gilmer, a lawyer, says, no, we need our own club. So I began to think about it. We don't want a big fight here. They have their good ideas. Maybe they should have a Virginia Train Club. It doesn't have to be a part of TCA. And I've kind of backed off. And I said, look, Lou, do you realize that our president, the first president of the United States, George Washington, was really the founder of the railroads that were successful? And Lou said, hell, he did. There weren't any railroads in those days. That's true. But George Washington, as the new president, realized that if this country was going to grow, there had to be a way of connecting people who were far distant from where George Washington and the original formation was. Oddly enough, by the way, York, Pennsylvania was our first capital. But there had to be a connection between people who lived way, way out there in the boondocks, and all we had were horses and a few carriages. So George Washington really founded the beginning of a railroad. And he didn't even know what a locomotive was, because there wasn't any. So what he did, he laid the James River Canal. And that canal, interestingly enough, extended from Richmond, Virginia, out to a town called Buchanan. That's as far as it got, which was a long way in those days. In order to have the boat move from Richmond out towards the west, which it was going to Buchanan, it had to have some kind of motivation. There weren't any steam engines. You couldn't sail on a canal, which is all surrounded by trees that cut down the wind. So they took donkeys and mules and horses, and they made a path along the canal, and they'd pull the canal boat from Richmond way out west. And that way we got goods going. Then about that time, there was a man by the name of Stephenson, and there were others who had worked on the idea of steam motivation. But Stephenson was the first successful one, and he developed a steam locomotive. The further development came where finally they decided this path that had been solidified by the stomping of mules for years and years and years might make a good base for a railroad. So they laid down track, first putting down timber with steel plates on top of it so that a steel wheel could ride and be guided by rails, and it went along the original path laid out by George Washington. Then a man came along, and his name was Crozet, and he decides this idea ought to be formed into a company, and it was the first railroad. Now, oddly enough, that first railroad was the Louisa Railroad. Well, now here's where my friends are from, Louisa. And I thought, this is a good reason why these boys ought to have their own club, because Louisa was the first railroad. So I tell John Gilmer and Jack Hewson and Bill Pettit, I'll tell Lou Redmond, lay low. Let these boys form a club. Might be a real good idea. George Washington had a good idea. And that Louisa Railroad became what we know of today as the C&O Railroad. Really all out of the brain of George Washington. Now maybe these boys have got something. Louisa. So we formed Virginia Train Collectors. Wayne Handy says we could meet at the Holiday Inn on Broad Street, right across the street from the radio tower WRVA. So we met there for a forming meeting. And I may be corrected on this, but I think our first president was a fellow by the name of Eggleston. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he got a good job that took him away from Richmond, and so he was only our president for a short time. But the group was organized and became a thriving group of collectors and friends in Richmond, born out of a few guys in Louisa. And today we're the Virginia Train Collectors, and that hotel is where we formed the first group of some 30 boys collecting old toy trains. And I think it's a good thing, and I'm glad it happened.
I was at gas pump here in Louisa one day at Bill Pettit's shop, and I knew the Pettit very well. I wasn't real close with Bill at that time. And Bill was pumping gas for me, and I said, Bill, do you know anybody around here that's got any old trains? And he kind of looked at me kind of funny. And he said, yes, I do. So anyway, one thing led to another. And one weekend, it happened to be the weekend that my father-in-law died in Richmond, he said, well, let's go down to Newport News. There's a friend of mine down there who has old trains. So we did. We went down there and met Chip and Marie. I don't remember their last names, but it doesn't make any difference. And sure enough, I bought my first collectible toy train, which was a Lionel 252 with two little cars, and I bought the blue, one of the American Flyer blue trains at the time, and that sort of started me. Well, Don Johnson, who was one of my old gun collector friends, he was by the office one day in Louisa, and he said, do you have a hunting bow? Because he was a bow hunter. And I said, yes, I've got one. He said, what do you want for it? And I said, I don't want to sell it, but I'll swap it to you. He said, what do you want? And I said, well, I like old trains, got an interest in old trains now. You get me some old trains and I'll swap you the bow for it if I like it. He said, well, I see that stuff all the time when I go through the country here. So, Bill, you've got to know, got to have known Don Johnson. He's dead now. But Don was a go-getter. It wasn't long before he amassed a collection of toy trains that I never saw, but I knew about them. Well, he met Rich Eggleston, who was a Yankee from up in, I don't know where he's from, Midwest somewhere, and he was a member of the TCA. And let me back up a little bit. After I met Bill and we went down to see Chip and Marie, we joined the TCA, and that's where Bill and I both attended our first York meet in April of 1974, and we became members. We've been going ever since. But Don, the first thing I knew after, well, he came back from one of his trips and I said, "Did you find me a train?" He said, "Yes, I did, but I liked it so much I'm going to keep it." So he did. He kept it, which is all right with me because I'd passed it up. I'd seen it before. And anyway, we got this letter from Rich Eggleston and Don Johnson, which said that they were going to meet in Richmond at the Holiday Inn, I believe it was, on Broad Street, which is where the SAL building was, the Seaboard Airline building, right near there. So we're going to meet on such and such a date, and I put a copy of that in the magazine article. So that was our first meeting. I don't remember the exact date of it, but it seemed to me like it was in the fall of 1970. Well, isn't that odd? I can't remember the exact year. Whatever it was our first meeting. We had about 25 or 30 people there. Jim Crone was there, and so we decided we wanted to organize, and what we did, we set a date for another meeting in about 1 or 2 months. Another month. It was on a Thursday night, just like our meetings have been recently. And so we met the second time, and that's when we decided on a name, Virginia Train Collectors. We had a number of people who proposed names, and we decided that was the best one for us, so we got together and appointed a bylaws committee, of which Bill Pettit, myself, and Robert Wood from, he was a pastor down in Albemarle County somewhere. His son had a train shop out at Wigwam not too many years ago. But anyway, we wrote proposed bylaws, and we gave it to the club at that second meeting, and we were underway. And that started off the Virginia Train Collectors. We decided at that time that the people who attended the first two meetings would become our charter members. And that's how the Virginia Train Collectors got started. That was one of the ideas of a number of people, including myself, to become what would be a chapter of maybe the Eastern Division. I learned that's what we were in, of the TCA, and that was the idea a number of us had to begin with. But we decided nobody pushed for it, and nobody was particularly interested in it. And then as we began to have our own meets and realized the restrictions that the TCA has on their meets, that we didn't want that. At least I felt that way, and a number of others. So we just decided not to bother about a TCA connection. We wanted to be ourselves, and we were. And I think it worked out for the better that way. Because what we can have is our own meets. We can invite anybody we want to. And we found this pretty successful because most of the people that came to our meets and had tables, most of them would join.
I became interested in toy trains naturally because of the Christmas period when everybody had a little wind-up train, winding it up and running it around a track. And my dad, who was an engineer and a mechanical kind of person, he thought I ought to have an electric train. So we would go into Buffalo, New York, and we'd look at these electric trains. And I remember especially a hardware company called Weeded Company that my dad did business with in his construction work. And at Christmas time, they would display electric trains. This was far better than winding up and waiting for it to die down at the end of the road. So we looked at Lionel trains, and this happens to be the first Lionel locomotive that I received Christmas 1926, a Lionel 252. Oddly enough, I had my friends, little boys that I was in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, come to look at my new toy. They said, "Oh, that's not a train, that's a trolley car." All because it looked the same on both ends. It was an electric train because Lionel had copied the electric trains that ran through the tunnel onto the island of Manhattan, all caused because of a serious train accident where a steam locomotive went through the tunnel to get onto Manhattan and rammed into a stalled passenger train, killing many, many people. Because of that accident, the law came about that no longer would Manhattan ever run a steam locomotive. So they were all electric locomotives operating on the island of Manhattan. And Lionel looked at that, and he decided that he would make electric trains, which looked like the prototype. So this was my first electric train. Then I got interested in other things, had to decide how I was going to make a living through life. But all the time I'd look back at these toys, and I guess oddly enough, I decided if you want to stay young, you pick an age you like and stick with it. So I always had a bit of childhood around me. But then I noticed there were other people who had an interest, and some of them were collecting the old wind-ups that they had when they were a little kid. And then as time went on, we entered a big Second World War. Now, when that came about, the things we thought about were far different than toy trains.
Well, I had to start with myself. And as I gave a talk to the club some months ago about my childhood trains, they weren't really mine, they were family trains. And there was the old India train that was given to my brother back in 1918, Christmas 1921. And anyway, I remember that from the attic. It was broken. I didn't know why it wouldn't run. I found out later. But that was sort of a, it wasn't an obsession or anything of that nature, but that, I wonder what electric trains would be like. And in 1933, we first got our first train. Santa Claus bought a little Lionel Ives and train, and Santa Claus added to that collection, I call it collection, every year until about 1940. And so what we would do, we didn't have a train around the Christmas tree. The other room there, which is called our drawing room, that was a Christmas tree room. And it had one big rug on the floor, very similar to this one. And after the spell of the day was over, headed by my father, we would lay out, and we got some fantastic layouts. The whole floor would be covered with trains, not a table or anything of that nature. So that went on as long as, up until the time I left home. In fact, I have one picture of my brother and his wife here during the war when I was overseas, and they were playing with electric trains. They sent me a picture of it. And so that was I've always had interest in toy trains. And never did much. My oldest son, Johnny, I gave him a train. In 1953, I gave him a Lionel train and came out here for Christmas. My dad gave him another one, so he had two of them right off the bat. So that was an interest, I guess you'd call it a residual interest there somewhere. In 1973, we were getting ready to leave Richmond. And in Christmas of 1973, I bought my son Charlie a Lionel set. It's a blue something or other, freight set. And we played with that for a few weeks in the basement of Richmond, and that kind of kicked it in. And I began to get interested in toy trains. When I was in Richmond, I took one of the old trains that wasn't working anymore to, I forget the man's name that lived, Tommy Farmer worked for him. He lived, he was a member of our club. He lived in, his shop was across the river in Forest Hill area. And that sort of began it. I've got the reputation of being a marksman, and only a marksman to some people. They don't know that I had like other things as well. But Marx is a fascinating toy. Marx is a toy king, Louis Marx. He also made a number of nice trains. Now this little car right here is called the Joy Line. And the Joy Line was made, it was a predecessor of Marx. Marx, I think this was made by somebody named Girard, Pennsylvania. I forget who the person that did it was. But he had this line of Joy Line trains which came out in the very early 30s or late 20s. And Louis Marx bought them. He was first the agent to sell them, and then he bought them later on. And in 1934 is when he started his first Marx trains with the Marx symbol on them. And this little car right here is not a Marx in one sense of the word. It's a predecessor to the Marx. Well, Marx made some beautiful lithography. It's absolutely beautiful. This little trolley back here is modern, but it gives an idea of what kind of work Marx did. But Marx made other things too. After the war, they started into plastics, and I never was much on plastic trains. But some of them are real nice. In particular, this Boston, I'm going to get up there, Boston and Maine, yeah, here we are, Bud car. Now Lionel made the big one. They made, well, I think everybody's familiar with that. It was 400 and had a companion. One of them was motorized and one of them was not. And it was considered bigger than that, but the Bud car was a post-war Lionel car, and of course it was plastic. It was bigger than this, and I think it was made for the B&O, if I'm not mistaken. And incidentally, when I lived in Maryland, I lived right off of that railroad, and we used to see these Bud cars come by. This was long before I moved back to Virginia. Well, this is one that, the Boston and Maine car, and this is one that when one day at York, every time they'd see me, they'd kid me, you know, about what you got in Marx and things like that. And I told Jack, I've got something you've never seen before. And they said, what's that? A Marx Bud car. Jack wouldn't believe it. I went in my bag and brought this car out and showed it to him. And he looked at that, he turned over this. He said, well, I'll be doggone. It sure is. So that's one time when Jack kind of softened a little bit toward Marx. He softened a little bit on that. Well, we know that Marx is Marx, and since that time I've become interested in other things, in particular Ives. And that's the story on the Bud car here.
I really don't recall vividly about any particular meet. I've just been a little fascinated by the fact that we have stayed together and we've grown together and we actually have become a strong group. I thought about it the other night when we came back from our Eastern Division meet in York, Pennsylvania, where thousands gather from all over the country. The interesting thing was the Virginia train collectors, for the most part, they belong to TCA, and they go and they participate and they find interesting things. And what we have done, we have formed a kind of a group of people who go and then come back to RVTC, and they have a little meeting where they have a show and tell, and they tell about what they found. And lots of times it'll be something brand new that we've never thought about, although the piece is old. So I think that's a unique part of the Virginia Train Collectors. We go to the large meet in York, Pennsylvania, but we come back and talk about what we found. And it makes a unique camaraderie of a group of toy train collectors.
About the time we started, we had been to York, and somebody was advertising in the local paper called the Central Virginian, wanted old toy trains. Well, of course, that set off a trigger. And I didn't know who it was, and Bill didn't know who it was. We inquired, and name didn't ring a bell with me. I forget what Jack's. It turned out about Jack Houston's mother. Jack was living in Richmond, but he's from Mineral, which is about 5 miles down the road. And so she was advertising for him. He was collecting all of his own. This was before we met him through the TCA. It was before the Virginia Train Collectors came into being. And Jack was one of the, Rich Eggleston and Don Johnson were the ramrods for that first couple of meetings, but Jack soon became, I think he was the second president or third president, I'm not sure which he was, but he was the prime mover behind it all. And it turned out that Jack's mother was the one who was wanting to, anybody had old toy trains. I never did get in touch with her, and I don't think Bill did either. But we found out that later on, and Dottie Moss was her name, Dorothy Moss, and she came out here to a couple of our early picnics when Jack would have her over here. And then Dick Mills is another early one. Dick, doesn't come very often, but he's one of the, he's still a collector. Because Jack died a number of years ago, we all know that. We all miss him a whole lot now. Dick Mills was another one who was, had roots in Louisa too. His father, I think, was a retired Coast Guard officer. I think he retired before the war. But anyway, Dick and his brothers were raised here in Louisa. His mother was a librarian at the school. I didn't know all that because I was older than that. And Dick particularly liked marks, among other things. And he had a good layout in his home. If you ever been there, he's got a terrific layout. And Dick's not as active in this as he used to be, but I think he still likes the trains. And so Dick became quite interested. He was the one who started off our magazine. He was the first editor. I don't know how many issues how many years he stayed, maybe just 1 or 2, I'm not sure about that. And then we had Wayne Handy, and Wayne was our second elected president. Rich Eggleston moved to Chicago. His company moved him. He went out west, and he remained a life member of this club. As far as I know, there are only 3 life members, incidentally. Don Johnson, Rich Eggleston, and myself. And the way I became a life member, I was told we decided to incorporate. And after we incorporated, I said, I'm not going to charge you for this, but if you were to give me life membership, I would be very nice. So they did. That's how I became a life member, and I'm glad I did. But I just got so many memories of the Virginia Train Collectors. I never wasn't interested in becoming a president or anything of that nature. I threatened, well, if I ever get to be president, you can come down to Louisa for meetings. So that, right off the bat, that deters anybody from voting for me, for even nominating me for president, which I didn't want to do anyway. One thing that we talk about these days is Jack Houston's famous lemonade. Well, Jack Houston made real lemonade. He brought out a great big Must have been a 10-gallon crock. And he had a paddle, a canoe paddle. And I don't know whether he did it in Richmond or bought it here, but he took that stuff and we furnished the water through our hose. And Jack would put all the ingredients in there and stir it up, and that was the Jack's lemonade. It was delicious. But they forgot one thing. They forgot the Mark's Dipper. I had a nice new white dipper. It was metal enameled, you know, like the old-fashioned dipper. And I drew a Mark's symbol on the bottom of it. So that's what I call the Mark's Dipper. And I claim it's good, but it's not quite as good as it used to be, because not only is it Jack's formula, but it didn't have the Mark's Dipper with it. Now, if they want to go back to real Jack Hewson lemonade, they got to have that dipper, and I'll be glad to lend it to them. Well, we had talk about our summer picnics. The first one we had was down in Tidewater somewhere. I don't remember exactly where it was. I think it was before we started coming here. And it was about the second year, I believe. I forget who it was that got us a place down there, and we had a very nice picnic at one of the public parks near Newport News, I think. I have to look up the records for that. And we did a lot of swapping, and I picked up some nice things, and everybody else had a wonderful time. So we decided, let's do it again next year.
I think there's a unique part of our club, and a part which is enjoyed by not only the members themselves, but the families of the members. There's been lots and lots of work put in by individuals to put our meets together, where our members go and they find new items and discover new items. All of that's wonderful. But twice a year, we meet as families and friends of these members. Our Christmas party used to be free in the beginning. They'd find a place to meet. Wayne Handy would get us a place where we could have a meal served for a Christmas party. And he'd get all the help together, and we'd celebrate Christmas as toy train collectors. Then we'd go for another 6 months, and we'd come together again. And we would meet in Ashland, where Hill Carter would always get us this wonderful place to meet, no matter whether it was a hot day or a rainy day. We were protected by a beautiful building, and come together for a picnic. The unique part of that picnic, of course, was the lemonade, the recipe of our longtime beloved member, Jack Hewson. And we'd toast each other with a lemonade by Jack Hewson. And then Hill Carter would see to it that all of these young people and older boys who loved trains not only could have a table to display their trains on when they were eating, but the little kids could run around, and all of a sudden, every 20 minutes, they'd see a real locomotive blast his whistle and go by on the RF&P Railroad. Now, what could be better for a train collectors club? It's unique.